buried beneath the cold soil, chains biting into his wrists. The slave's last breath fogged the winter air. His mistress had ordered the ground shoveled over him, alive, mocking that no one would ever hear his screams. But she was wrong. That night in 1836, in the swamps of Louisiana, a story of vengeance was born. The man who rose from the earth would not remain silent. He would burn, poison, and slaughter until the plantation trembled with fear. The air in Louisiana was always heavy, thick with the wet breath of the swamps and the sweetness of rotting cane. It clung to the lungs, making every step on the plantation feel like walking through water. This was the world of the Boudreaux plantation in 1836, a place of endless rows of sugarcane that swayed like prison bars, hiding screams that never reached the outside world. Here, under the unflinching rule of its mistress, hundreds of enslaved souls lived and died in chains. Among them was one man who would one day rise from the earth itself, Isaiah. Isaiah's first memory was not of kindness, but of chains. He had been born behind the stables, his mother screaming as the overseer barked for her to hurry and finish. No cradle, no baptism, no lullabies, just the cold floor and the knowledge that his life was already owned by another. His mother, Ruth, whispered to him in the dead of night, telling him stories of survival, prayers she claimed even God could hear from the cotton rows. But Isaiah also grew up with a hole in his heart, for his father was not there. When he was only 5 years old, Isaiah overheard the older slave's whisper of a man who had once dared to strike an overseer with a hoe, splitting his skull. That man had been hanged at the edge of the fields, his body swaying for days as a warning. They said his name in hushed tones, Ezekiel. Ruth never confirmed it, but Isaiah knew in his bones. That man was his father. And with that knowledge came a dangerous fire. Others took the story as a warning. Isaiah carried it as an inheritance. The Boudreaux plantation was unlike many others, for the master himself was often absent. The land was ruled instead by his wife, Marguerite Boudreaux. She was no ordinary mistress, but a woman whose cruelty was spoken of even in neighboring parishes. Her silks gleamed as brightly as her jewels, but her heart was darker than the swamp at midnight. Where other mistresses sometimes feigned gentility, Marguerite displayed her power openly. She believed pain was not only a punishment, it was a form of art. She kept a small riding crop beside her chair during meals, striking whichever slave served too slowly. She laughed at the sight of blood. Her punishments were legendary. Some were forced to kneel on rock salt until their skin split. Others were made to carry buckets of water until their arms gave way. But nothing terrified the slaves more than what she called the burial. The burial was her invention, and it was worse than the whip. She would order a pit dug in the ground, force the slave to lie inside, bind their wrists with chains, and have them covered with dirt until only their face remained. Sometimes she left them like that for hours under the sun. Sometimes overnight, letting the insects feast on their skin. A few never came out alive. It was said the ground itself became cursed with their cries. Isaiah witnessed his first burial when he was only 15. A girl named Dinah, no more than 13, had stolen a heel of bread from the kitchen. Marguerite smiled as she ordered the pit to be dug. Isaiah watched as Dinah begged, her small body trembling, her words choking with fear. The dirt rained over her until she could hardly breathe, her screams muffled beneath the earth. By evening, she was silent. That night, Isaiah could not sleep. He carved her name into the wood of his quarters with a nail, swearing he would never forget. From that day on, the image of Dinah haunted him. But it also hardened him. Every time the overseer's whip lashed across his back, Isaiah did not cry out. Every time Marguerite struck him, he clenched his jaw. His silence was his rebellion, though it infuriated those who tried to break him. The overseer, a man named Jonas Pike, took particular pleasure in trying to shatter Isaiah's will. Pike was a brute with a red face and hands as thick as shovels, a drunkard who carried a whip like an extension of his arm. He beat Isaiah for walking too slowly, for looking too directly into his eyes, for lifting his head when Marguerite passed. But no matter how many lashes Pike delivered, Isaiah's silence remained unbroken. This silence unsettled even the other slaves. They feared it would draw more cruelty down upon them all. And yet, at night in the quarters, Isaiah's voice returned. He told stories of his father's hanging, stories of chains that snapped like twigs, stories of fires sweeping through a plantation and setting men free. His voice was low and steady, but every word carried weight. Some slaves begged him to stop, to not put such dangerous thoughts into their minds. Others leaned closer, their eyes wide with desperate hope. Isaiah became a quiet leader, though he never claimed the title. He studied the plantation as if it were a map. He knew which overseer drank himself to sleep, which guard left his post to meet a woman, which locks rusted in the rain. He noticed where Marguerite kept the keys to the chains, how long she lingered at the church after Sunday services, how her pride blinded her to certain dangers. But survival required patience, and patience meant enduring. Each day was a test, cane cutting beneath the blazing sun, the sting of sweat in open wounds, the smell of blood in the fields. Each night was a reminder, chains clinking in the dark, whispers of escape, the moans of those too broken to rise from their beds. And through it all, Isaiah carried the memory of Dinah, the echo of his father's name, and the knowledge that revenge was not a dream but a seed waiting to grow. It was in the winter of 1836, during the Christmas season, that Isaiah's patience was finally tested beyond measure. On most plantations, Christmas brought a brief reprieve. Slaves were given scraps of food, moments of song, sometimes even small gifts. But not on the Boudreaux plantation. For Marguerite, Christmas was not a season of mercy, it was a theater of power. She ordered longer hours in the fields, larger feasts for her guests, harsher punishments for the slightest mistakes. On Christmas Eve, the slaves were forced into the church, standing in the back while Marguerite and her guests feasted near the altar. As hymns filled the air, Isaiah's body ached from labor, his lips cracked from thirst. When Marguerite demanded that he kneel, Isaiah was slow, just a heartbeat too slow. But in her eyes, it was enough. Her gaze fell upon him like a blade. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that meant suffering would follow. In that single glance, Isaiah's fate was sealed. Marguerite would show the others that even silence could be broken, that even Isaiah could be made to beg. She ordered the overseers to prepare the burial pit. The slaves whispered in terror. Some prayed, some wept. But Isaiah remained still, his expression calm. Inside, however, a storm was raging. He had always known this day would come, the day when Marguerite's cruelty would turn upon him fully. But what she did not know was that Isaiah had been preparing for this moment his entire life. Because a man buried alive is not always dead. Sometimes he rises. And when he rises, the earth itself trembles. What Isaiah did after that night would shock the entire plantation. The pit was dug at the edge of the cane fields, just past the line where the swamp began. The ground there was damp, rich with the smell of rotting leaves and stagnant water. Frogs croaked in the distance, their song mocking the horror about to unfold. The slaves were gathered to watch. Marguerite wanted witnesses. She always wanted witnesses. Isaiah stood chained, his wrists bound in iron cuffs that bit into his skin. The overseer Jonas Pike grinned as he swung a spade into the dirt, each scoop of soil falling with a dull thud. "This one won't last an hour," he muttered, sweat dripping down his ruddy face. Other overseers laughed, their voices mingling with the crackling sound of insects in the cane. Marguerite appeared, draped in a deep green dress that shimmered even under the dim winter sky. She carried a parasol, though there was no sun, a picture of elegance among the mud and blood. Her voice was smooth, almost sweet, as she spoke. "Silence may protect a man for a time," she said, her eyes on Isaiah. "But silence is also cowardice. And cowards must learn to scream." The slaves shivered, heads lowered. None dared to meet her gaze. Isaiah's eyes, however, lifted, just slightly, just enough for Marguerite to see the burning beneath them. That flicker of defiance was what enraged her most. "Lay him down," she ordered. Two men, trembling, were forced to obey. They dragged Isaiah into the pit, chains clinking, iron scraping against stone. The earth was cold against his back, and the smell of damp soil filled his nose. Above him, the gray sky seemed far away, as if already closing its doors. Jonas Pike spat into the pit before shoveling dirt over Isaiah's legs. The weight pressed down, slow and crushing. With every layer, Isaiah's breath grew shallower. The soil clung to his skin, cold and merciless. When the dirt reached his chest, the overseers laughed. "Breathe deep, mule," Jonas jeered. "Might be your last." Isaiah remained silent. He would not give them the satisfaction of hearing fear. Marguerite leaned over, her perfume mingling with the stench of earth. "When you beg," she whispered, "perhaps I will let you live." The dirt climbed higher. Isaiah's ribs strained with each breath. His arms, bound in chains, could not move. Soil pressed against his throat, his mouth, his nose. Darkness edged his vision. The world became soundless, heavy, suffocating. But in that darkness, Isaiah found memory. He saw his father's body swaying from the noose. He saw Dinah's small face, dirt pouring over her as she screamed. He saw his mother's eyes, weary but unbroken, whispering that God had not forgotten them. And in that moment, Isaiah swore he would not die here. The earth could cover his body, but it would not bury his spirit. Then, silence. The overseers patted the soil flat, leaving only Isaiah's face visible, his lips coated in dust. They laughed as they walked away, leaving him under the watch of a young guard who leaned lazily against a tree. Marguerite returned to the house, satisfied that the mule would be broken by morning. But Isaiah's eyes stayed open. He blinked the dirt away, breathing shallow but steady. Each breath was agony, but it was also survival. Hours passed. The sky turned black, stars faint above the fields. The cold crept into his bones. The young guard drank himself into a stupor, his head lolling forward. Isaiah began to move. Not much, just the slightest flex of his fingers, the tightening of muscles. The chain scraped against stone. Slowly, painfully, he shifted his wrist, pushing against the damp earth. The soil gave way just a little, just enough for air to slip in. He pushed again. His chest screamed for breath. His lungs burned. But with each movement, the earth loosened. By midnight, his right hand had worked free from the dirt, the iron cuff grinding against rock until skin tore open. Blood soaked the soil, but the pain only fed his rage. Inch by inch, he carved a pocket of space around his arm. He clawed at the earth, fingers raw, nails breaking. He was rising, not fast, not easily, but rising all the same. Far off, in the slave quarters, men and women whispered prayers. Some believed Isaiah was already dead, his spirit taken. Others swore they heard the ground itself groaning. They did not know the truth, that Isaiah was clawing his way back from the grave. By dawn, the pit looked unchanged to the casual eye. But beneath the soil, Isaiah had freed both arms. His body was battered, suffocated, trembling with exhaustion, but the fire in him had only grown. He waited, conserving what little strength he had. The time for revenge was not yet, but it was coming. The next day, when overseers returned, they expected to find a broken man gasping for mercy. Instead, they found Isaiah still silent, still breathing, his eyes burning brighter than ever. Marguerite's smile faltered for the briefest second. She covered it quickly with laughter, but something inside her had shifted. She had tried to bury him alive, and he had endured. That night, chained in the quarters, Isaiah whispered to the others. His voice was hoarse but steady. "The earth tried to hold me," he said, "but it could not keep me. No chain, no whip, no grave can hold us forever." The others listened, their eyes wide with fear and awe. For the first time, they began to believe Isaiah was not just a man, he was a force. But Marguerite was not finished. She would try again. She would break him or destroy him. The overseer Jonas Pike took her orders with glee, plotting new punishments, sharpening his whip. The stage was being set, the conflict sharpened like a blade. And Isaiah? He was waiting, watching, gathering his fury like kindling for the fire to come. Because when he finally struck back, the plantation would drown in blood and flames. The winter nights after the burial were colder than Isaiah had ever known. His body ached, his skin split where chains had rubbed against bone, and his lungs burned with every breath. But he was alive. That truth alone gave him power. On the Boudreaux plantation, no slave had ever endured the burial and walked away whole. But Isaiah had, and the others began to look at him differently. In the quarters, whispers spread like fire through dry cane. Some called him cursed, touched by spirits who refused to let him die. Others believed he was chosen, a vessel for the vengeance of every soul who had perished beneath Marguerite's cruelty. Isaiah did not claim either. He simply sat in silence, his eyes glowing in the dim firelight, watching, waiting. But deep inside, something had shifted. He no longer thought of survival. He thought only of retribution. The overseer, Jonas Pike, noticed the change. He saw the way the other slaves leaned closer when Isaiah spoke, how their fear seemed to bend toward him like reeds to the wind. Pike hated it, and so he doubled his efforts, beating Isaiah with fresh fury, dragging him to the fields before dawn, forcing him to labor long after others had collapsed. Yet no matter how many blows he delivered, Isaiah endured. His silence now was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of a man sharpening his soul into a weapon. Marguerite, too, sensed it. Though she laughed in her silks and spoke with venom-sweet tones, she could not shake the memory of Isaiah's eyes staring back at her from beneath the dirt. It was unnatural, she told herself. It was defiance where there should have been only despair. She resolved that if Isaiah would not break, he would eventually be destroyed. But Isaiah's endurance gave him something far more valuable than fear. It gave him time. And in that time, he began to plan. Every night, lying on the dirt floor of the quarters, Isaiah's mind worked like a machine. He mapped every corner of the plantation, every locked door, every path through the cane. He knew the sound of each overseer's boots, the creak of every gate, the hour at which the guards drifted to sleep. He memorized when Marguerite left for church, how long her carriage lingered, and when she returned. And most importantly, he remembered where the mistress kept her poisons. Marguerite was fascinated by herbs, roots, and tinctures. She often kept bottles of powders and liquids for her own medicinal experiments. Slaves whispered that she had once poisoned a rival's daughter, though nothing was ever proven. These poisons were locked in a cabinet in the pantry. Isaiah had seen the keys, hanging from her waist like ornaments. He knew he could never take them by force, not yet, but he waited for the moment she would slip. Meanwhile, Isaiah began to weave a quiet rebellion in words. In hushed whispers, he spoke to the others. "They bury us," he said, voice low but steady, "but the earth spits us back out. They think chains hold us, but fire melts chains. The master, the mistress, the overseer, they bleed as we do. And one day, they will bleed for us." Some shook their heads in terror, begging him to stop before someone overheard. But others listened with wide eyes, their hunger for justice outweighing their fear. Slowly, Isaiah gathered around him a small circle of believers, men and women who had lost too much to remain silent. One was Elias, a wiry man whose wife had been sold away for speaking out of turn. Another was Naomi, a woman with scars across her back who had survived the whip more times than she could count. Together, they became Isaiah's shadow counsel, whispering in corners, gathering scraps of food, sharpening tools into makeshift weapons. The plan was not yet clear, but the desire was. They would strike not with a single blow, but with fire, with poison, with blood. They would not simply escape, they would make the plantation remember their names forever. The turning point came on a night thick with fog, when Marguerite hosted a feast. It was the New Year of 1837, and she invited neighbors, overseers, and merchants to display her power. The slaves were forced to serve at the long table carrying platters of roasted pig, candied yams, and spiced wine. Music filled the hall, laughter echoing like cruel bells. Marguerite sat at the head of the table, her jewels glittering, her parasol resting by her chair. Isaiah stood behind her, serving dish after dish, his chains rattling softly. And then he saw it. The keys. They hung loosely from her waist, glimmering in the candlelight. For years he had watched them. For years he had waited. And now the chance was before him. When Marguerite rose to toast her guests, Isaiah moved. Smoothly, silently, his hand brushed against her skirts. The key slipped into his palm, concealed within the folds of a napkin. He withdrew before she turned, his face blank, his body still. The hall roared with applause, glasses clinking, and no one noticed. That night, as the slaves cleared the tables, Isaiah slipped into the pantry. His hands trembled as he unlocked the cabinet. Inside lay bottles of green glass, powders in jars, and vials sealed with wax. He touched them gently, almost reverently. Here was death, waiting to be claimed. He took only a small amount, a vial of clear liquid, a pouch of bitter powder. Enough to test, to begin. He locked the cabinet once more and returned the keys before dawn, slipping them back onto Marguerite's belt as she slept in her chair. She never stirred. In the days that followed, Isaiah tested the poisons carefully. A drop into a rat's water, a pinch into a stray dog's food. He watched as they convulsed, as they stilled. The power filled him with grim satisfaction. He had found his weapon. But poison alone would not be enough. Fire, too, would be needed. Isaiah and Elias began collecting scraps of cloth, small jars of oil stolen from the barn. Naomi sharpened hidden blades, concealed in folds of clothing. Each night, they gathered, whispering their plan beneath the crackle of the hearth. Isaiah's voice carried them. On the night of their feast, we strike. The mistress will drink her own poison. The overseer will fall by the blade. And the plantation will burn until the chains melt. The others nodded, fear trembling in their bones, but also a fierce light in their eyes. They were ready. The night of vengeance was coming. The chains had been worn too long, the ground too often fed with innocent blood. Isaiah had risen once from the grave, and now he would rise to bury his oppressors. What he unleashed on that night would shock Louisiana forever. The night chosen for vengeance was shrouded in thick fog, the kind that crawled low across the ground and muffled sound. The Boudreaux plantation stood in eerie silence, its great house glowing with candlelight as laughter and music spilled into the night air. Marguerite Boudreaux was hosting yet another feast, her favorite stage for cruelty disguised as elegance. Neighbors, merchants, and overseers filled the long table, their glasses brimming with wine, their voices rising in drunken cheer. In the shadows of the kitchen, Isaiah waited. Chains still clinked faintly at his wrists, but inside he was no longer a slave. Inside, he was fire. Naomi stood beside him, her hands trembling as she carried a tray of bread. Elias adjusted the cloth at his waist, concealing the blade he had sharpened from a scythe. The others moved quietly, each one carrying a piece of the storm about to break. Isaiah's eyes burned as he whispered the words that had become their prayer. Tonight, the earth takes back what it was forced to give. They entered the hall. The air was heavy with the smell of roasted pig and spiced wine. Candles flickered, shadows dancing across the walls. The guests laughed, oblivious. At the head of the table sat Marguerite, draped in crimson silk, jewels sparkling at her throat. Her parasol rested by her chair, her hand curled delicately around a silver goblet. Beside her was Jonas Pike, the overseer, his red face glowing with drink. His whip hung at his belt even here, as though cruelty were his second skin. Isaiah moved forward, his step silent, his face blank as always. He carried a pitcher of wine. But this wine was not as it seemed. Hours before, Isaiah had slipped a vial of bitter liquid into it, the poison mixing invisibly with the dark red drink. Tonight, Marguerite would taste her own medicine. He poured slowly into her goblet. The liquid swirled, rich and inviting. She lifted it with a smile, raising it high to toast her guests. "To the Boudreaux name," she declared. "To power everlasting." The goblets clinked, the hall echoed with cheer. Marguerite drank deeply. For a moment, nothing happened. Laughter swelled again, knives scraping against plates. But then Marguerite's smile faltered. Her hand trembled, the goblet slipping slightly. She coughed once, twice, the sound sharp against the music. Guests turned, concern flickering across their faces. Then she gasped, clutching her throat. Her body convulsed, knocking the silver goblet to the floor with a ringing crash. The hall erupted in panic. "Mistress!" voices cried. Jonas Pike rushed forward, but before he could reach her, she collapsed across the table, food and wine spilling around her. Marguerite Boudreaux, the mistress who buried slaves alive, who laughed at their pain, was writhing before them, poisoned by the very hand she believed could never rise against her. Isaiah stood still, his eyes locked on hers. For the first time, she saw fear not in a slave's eyes, but in her own reflection. But the plan was not finished. Poison alone was not enough. Tonight would be fire and blood. Elias moved first. His blade flashed from beneath his claw, striking Jonas Pike across the throat. The overseer staggered back, clutching at the sudden red that spilled between his fingers. His eyes went wide with disbelief. He tried to speak, but only a gurgle came. Then he collapsed beside his mistress, his lifeblood soaking the floor. Chaos exploded. Guests screamed, chairs clattered to the ground. Some tried to flee, but Naomi and the others barred the doors, slamming heavy beams across them. Trapped like animals, the plantation's masters and merchants cried out in terror. Isaiah lifted a torch from the wall. Its flame hissed, sparks falling onto the floor. His voice rose above the chaos, deep and steady. "You buried us alive. Now the earth buries you." He hurled the torch onto the table. The linens caught fire instantly, flames racing across spilled wine and grease. The great hall filled with smoke, choking, searing. Guests shrieked as the fire spread, their silks and jewels worthless against the hunger of the blaze. Slaves moved with fury and precision. Some overturned the tables, trapping men beneath them. Others swung iron tools like weapons, striking down overseers who had rushed forward with pistols. The sound of chains clashing became the rhythm of vengeance, every blow a note in the song of freedom. Marguerite tried to rise, her face pale, her lips blue from the poison. She staggered, reaching for Isaiah, her voice rasping. "You, dog!" Isaiah stepped closer, towering over her. For years she had forced men into the earth, mocking their cries. Now she knelt before him, trembling, gasping. He leaned down, his words a whisper only she could hear. "The earth remembers, Marguerite, and so do I." With a final gasp, she collapsed, the flames closing in around her. The mistress of the Boudreaux plantation was no more. But Isaiah's vengeance was not yet complete. He stormed through the burning hall, flames roaring at his back. "Free them!" he shouted. Slaves poured into the house, keys stolen from Marguerite's belt passed from hand to hand. Chains fell to the ground with metallic thuds, wrists raised high in triumph. Outside, the fire spread to the cane fields, smoke rolling across the swamp like a dark tide. The night was filled with shouts, with cries, with the crackling of fire consuming everything it touched. Some slaves fled into the swamps, their silhouettes vanishing into the mist. Others stayed, striking down fleeing overseers, seizing weapons, destroying the tools of their oppression. Isaiah led them, his voice steady, his movements like a man possessed. At the edge of the fields, he paused. Behind him, the plantation burned, house, barn, cane fields, all swallowed by fire. The screams of the oppressors mingled with the roar of the flames, rising into the night sky like an offering to every soul who had ever suffered on that cursed land. For a moment, Isaiah closed his eyes. He felt the heat on his face, the chains falling from his wrists, the ground solid beneath his feet. He had been buried alive, and now he stood reborn in fire. But vengeance has a cost. Torches flared in the distance. Neighbors, alerted by the fire, were coming. Armed men on horseback thundered down the dirt road, rifles gleaming in the moonlight. Freedom was not yet won. Isaiah turned to the others. "Run to the swamps," he commanded. "Run and live. Do not look back." Elias hesitated. "And you?" Isaiah's eyes burned like the fire behind him. "I was buried once. If they take me, they'll have to bury me again. But tonight, the earth belongs to us." With that, he lifted his blade, standing tall as the riders approached. The others fled into the swamp, their shadows swallowed by the mist. Isaiah remained, a lone figure before the inferno, his silhouette outlined in fire. The night erupted in gunfire, shouts, and smoke. Isaiah fought with the strength of 10 men, his blade flashing, his body moving with fury. For every lash of the whip he had endured, for every burial he had witnessed, he carved a mark of vengeance. And though the numbers were against him, though the riders closed in, Isaiah did not falter. His story had already been written in fire. Because on that night, the plantation did not belong to the masters, the overseers, or even Marguerite. It belonged to the slaves, to the dead, to the earth itself. What became of Isaiah would soon become a legend. The smoke hung over Louisiana for days. Charred beams jutted from the ground like broken ribs, the once proud Boudreaux plantation reduced to ash and ruin. The great hall was gone, its crimson drapes burned to cinders, its silver melted into twisted pools. Neighbors who came upon the wreckage spoke in hushed tones, their boots crunching on blackened soil. What they saw was not just a fire, it was judgment. Marguerite Boudreaux's body was never recovered. Some claimed it had been consumed by the fire. Others whispered that Isaiah had buried her in the earth as she had buried so many before. But one truth was certain. The mistress was gone. Her reign of terror ended not by sickness or age, but by the hand of those she had once enslaved. Jonas Pike, the overseer, lay among the dead. His whip was found melted to his belt, a cruel symbol that even in death he could not part with the tool of his brutality. Guests who survived fled into the swamps, but many never returned. The fire spread too fast, the smoke too thick. Some perished in the cane fields, their jewels and fine clothes worthless against the hunger of the flames. And yet, for the slaves, the fire was not destruction. It was rebirth. Naomi, Elias, and dozens of others reached the swamps that night, their chains cast aside, their bodies moving with newfound freedom. They disappeared into the mist, finding refuge in maroon camps hidden deep among cypress trees and Spanish moss. There, among rebels and runaways, they built new lives, carrying Isaiah's name like a sacred chant. But Isaiah himself, his fate was less certain. Some said he died in the fire, consumed alongside the plantation, choosing to let the flames finish what they had begun. Others swore they saw him fighting until the last breath, blade flashing against riders, his figure a shadow of vengeance outlined in fire and smoke. And still others whispered of a man who appeared in the swamps weeks later, scarred but unbroken, his eyes burning with the memory of what he had done. Whether man or legend, Isaiah became more than flesh. He became a story. In the quarters of neighboring plantations, whispers spread like wildfire. The slave who was buried alive rose again. Around campfires, men told of how he poisoned his mistress, how he burned the house to the ground, how he slaughtered the overseer who thought himself untouchable. His name was spoken in secret by those still chained, a promise that even the deepest earth could not contain their will to rise. But for the masters, Isaiah's story was terror. Mothers hushed their children at night, saying his spirit roamed the swamps, watching, waiting. Overseers tightened their grip on their whips, glancing over their shoulders at every rustle in the cane. To them, Isaiah was a ghost of vengeance, proof that cruelty could awaken something far stronger than fear. Years later, when the Civil War swept across the South, old men still recalled the fire of 1836. Soldiers marching through Louisiana heard fragments of the tale, passing it along like scripture. Some called it myth. Others swore it was truth. But all agreed, Isaiah was no ordinary slave. He was a flame the earth itself had raised. Standing in the ashes of history, we are left with haunting questions. Did Isaiah truly escape into the swamps? Did he fall that night, blade in hand, defiant until the end? Or did he become something larger, a legend meant to remind us that no chain, no whip, no grave could silence the cry for freedom? What we know is this: the Boudreaux plantation never rose again. Its land lay scarred, its wealth gone, its name cursed. Where once there was laughter and cruelty under candlelight, there was only silence. And in that silence, the earth remembered. Imagine it now, the wind whispering through blackened cane fields, carrying echoes of chains striking the ground, of fire crackling, of voices crying in both terror and triumph. Imagine the earth itself holding those memories, unwilling to forget. Isaiah's story forces us to look closer, not just at one man's vengeance, but at the countless voices buried beneath history's soil. How many were silenced? How many lay forgotten, their cries smothered by earth and time? And how many, like Isaiah, rose again in defiance, if not in flesh, then in the stories that outlived them? His name may not appear in the ledgers of the masters. It may not stand carved in stone. But in the shadows of Louisiana, his story lingers, etched into the land itself. And so we close with the image of a man once buried alive, standing in fire, unbroken, unchained. The chains may fall silent. The fire may fade. But the earth remembers. Always.